In the gray years that followed the passing of the Third Age, when the dominion of men had spread across the length and breadth of Middle-earth, there came a time when shadows once more stirred in the forgotten places of the world. It was in the 37th year of King Elisar's reign that strange tidings reached the walls of Minas Tirith, carried by rangers who had ridden hard from the northern waste. Dunedain was the name by which men knew him in those days, though his true lineage stretched back through the mists of time to the ancient kings of Arnor. Tall he stood among the sons of Numenor, with eyes gray as storm clouds and hair dark as the shadow of mountain. Upon his brow lay the mark of kingship, though no crown adorned his head, for he was yet unblooded in the trials that would test the mettle of his spirit. The summons came to him as he kept vigil in the house of the king, where the white tree bloomed eternal in the court of the fountain. A messenger, travel-worn and bearing the seal of the Dunedain, knelt before the throne of Gondor and spoke words that would echo through the ages like the sound of doom. "My lord king," said he, his voice heavy with portent, "evil stirs in the northern reaches beyond the misty mountains. The rangers of Eriador speak of a darkness that walks upon the wind, and songs are heard in the night that freeze the blood of mortal men. From the ruins of Fornost comes word of lights that burn with cold fire, and the wolves flee southward as though driven by some terror beyond naming." King Elisar, who had looked upon the face of darkness and emerged victorious, felt a chill that no fire could warm. Long had he known that peace was but an interlude between the acts of a greater tale, and that evil, though defeated, was not destroyed utterly from the circles of the world. "What word of my kinsman who keeps watch in those lands?" asked the king, though his heart already knew the answer that would come. "Of Halbarad the younger, son of Halbarad, who fell at the Pelennor, no word has come these 7 days past. His rangers found naught but his horse, Rohald, wandering masterless upon the moors, and upon the beast's flanks were marks as of claws, though no earthly creature could have made them." Then did King Elisar turn his gaze upon Dunedain, and in his eyes was both sorrow and resolution. "Kinsman," said he, "the time has come for thee to take up the burden that is thine by right of blood. In the vaults beneath this city lies a blade of power, wrought in the elder days, when the skill of the Noldor was yet undiminished. Narsil that was, has been reborn as Anduril, but there is another sword, hidden long from the knowledge of men." 18 into the deep places beneath Minas Tirith they descended, through passages hewn from the living rock, in the days when Isildur ruled in Osgiliath. Past the tombs of the kings they went, beyond the chamber where lay the crown of Elendil, until they came at last to a door of black stone, upon which were carved the emblems of the house of Elendil. "Behold," said Elisar, as the door swung open upon silent hinges, "the blade, Anglakel, which in the tongue of the elves is called the Iron of the Flaming Star. Wrought was it by Eul, the dark elf in the forests of Nan Elmeth, and it was wielded of old by Beleg the Strongbow, and after him by Turin Turambar in the days when Morgoth yet held sway in the north. Upon an altar of white marble lay the sword, and at the sight of it Dunedain felt his heart quicken with both desire and dread. Black was the blade, darker than the depths of night, yet along its edges ran a tracery of silver that seemed to hold within it the light of stars. The crossguard was wrought in the likeness of ravens' wings, and the pommel bore a stone black as jet, within which seemed to dance flames of cold fire. "Long has it lain here," continued the king, "for it is a blade of power and peril, and not lightly is it taken up. For know this, Anglakel is no mere weapon of war, but a thing of will and malice, wrought with such skill that it lives and thinks after its own fashion. In the days of old it thirsted for the blood of its enemies, and some say that it sang with joy when battle was joined. Yet it is proud and treacherous, and has brought doom upon many who thought to master it. Why then do you offer it to me, my lord?" asked Dunedain, though his hand had already moved toward the hilt, as though drawn by some compulsion he could not name. "Because," replied Elisar, and his voice was heavy with the weight of prophecy, The darkness that stirs in the north is no common evil, but something that has slept since the breaking of Thangorodrim, and against such foes, only the weapons of the elder days may serve to turn aside the shadow. Take up the blade, kinsman, and let us see if the song it sings shall be of victory or woe. Thus it was that Dunedain, heir of Isildur's line, set his hand upon the hilt of Anglekel, and at his touch the blade began to sing, low, sweet at first, like the voice of wind through mountain passes, but growing ever stronger until the very stones of the chamber rang with its music. And in that song was both promise and peril, for those who listened with the ears of wisdom could hear within it the echo of deeds both great and terrible yet to come. 7 days after the taking up of Anglachel, Dunedain rode forth from the gates of Minas Tirith with a company of the guard of the citadel. At his side rode Hurin the Tall, a captain of Gondor whose lineage traced back to the men of Dor-Lomin, and with them went 20 picked men, each proved in battle and steadfast in loyalty. Yet it was with heavy hearts that they took the north road, for all felt the weight of doom upon them, though none could name the nature of the peril they rode to meet. Through Rohan they passed, and the Rohirrim who saw them upon the road blessed them and offered escort, for they too had heard whispers of strange things stirring in the wild lands beyond the misty mountains. But Dunedain declined their aid, saying that speed was of greater import than strength of arms, and that the road they must take was not for horses trained to the charge upon open field. At the ford of Bruinen they were met by Elladan and Elrohir, the sons of Elrond, who had ridden down from Rivendell upon hearing word of the ranger's errand. "Hail, Dunedain of the Dunedain," spoke Elladan, eldest of the brothers. "Long has it been since a son of Isildur's house bore Anglekel upon the roads of Middle-earth. We greet thee, and offer what aid we may, for the blood of Númenor is precious to us, and dark are the tidings that come out of the north." "What know you of this shadow that troubles the peace of Eriador?" asked Dunedain, for the wisdom of the Noldor was renowned throughout Middle-earth. "More than we would wish," replied Elrohir with grave countenance. "Our father's sight has grown dim with the passing of years, yet still does his spirit touch upon the currents of power that flow through all things. He speaks of an evil that was bound in the foundations of the earth, sealed away by powers that are no more. Yet now do the bonds weaken, and that which should have slept until the end of days stirs once more in its prison." Then did Elladan draw forth a scroll of white parchment, sealed with the sign of Gil-galad. "These words does our father send to thee, last scion of the kings of men. Let him who bears the black sword beware, for he walks a path that others have trod before him, and their doom may yet be his own. Yet know this also, in the darkest hour, when hope seems spent and the shadow covers all, then shall the blade sing truest, and in its song shall be both ending and beginning." Northward they rode through the Trollshaws, where the ancient stone trolls stood frozen in the light of day, and ever the way grew darker and more perilous. The very air seemed to thicken about them, and their horses grew restive and afraid. Strange sounds echoed through the hills at night, not the howling of wolves or the cry of eagles, but something else, something that spoke of intelligence malign and purpose dark. On the third day beyond Rivendell, as they made their way through the passes of the misty mountains, they came upon a sight that chilled the hearts of even the boldest among them. In a vale that had once been green with grass and bright with flowers, naught remained but blackened earth and stones that wept with some foul moisture. At the center of the desolation stood the remains of what had once been a tower of the Dunedain, but now its stones were twisted and melted, as though by heat beyond measure. Here stood Amon Sul, the Lesser, said Hurin, for he had studied the lore of the northern lands, a watchtower of the Ranger, built in the days when the kingdoms of Arnor still held sway over these lands. Many a time have I passed this way, and ever was it a place of strength and beauty. But now no strength remained, and beauty was transformed to horror. For upon the melted stones were carved runes that hurt the eyes to look upon, and from the ruins came a sound like the breathing of some vast creature that slept beneath the earth. It was then that Anglachel first sang in earnest, and its voice was like the clash of swords in battle. The blade grew warm at Dunedain's side, and though he had not drawn it from its sheath, all could hear its song rising and falling like the voice of wind through caverns deep. In that music was both warning and challenge, and Dunedain knew that they drew near to the source of the shadow that troubled the land. "Let us camp not here," counseled Elladan, "for this place reeks of evil, and the very ground beneath our feet has been poisoned by powers better left undisturbed." Yet even as they made to depart, the earth began to tremble, and from the ruins of the tower came a light that was not light, but rather a darkness visible that seemed to drink in the rays of the sun. Then did a voice speak from the twisted stones, and though it used the common speech, in its tones was an accent older than the kingdoms of men. "Welcome, bearer of the black sword," it said, and the words fell upon them like drops of poison. "Long have I waited for thee to come into the north, for thy coming was foretold in the days when the world was young. Anglachel sings at thy side, but does its bearer know the true history of the blade he carries? Does he know the price that must be paid for the power he has claimed?" Dunedain set his hand upon the hilt of the sword, and at his touch the blade's song grew stronger, drowning out the evil voice that spoke from the ruin. Yet still the words echoed in his mind, filling him with doubt and dark foreboding. For in the deep places of his heart he began to fear that the voice spoke truly, and that in taking up Anglachel he had set his feet upon a path that led only to doom. As the company pressed northward beyond the ruins of Amon Sul the Lesser, the very nature of the land began to change about them. Where once the hills of Rudor had rolled green beneath the open sky, now they found themselves traveling through a realm of shadow, where the sun seemed always veiled and the air hung thick with mist that clung to their cloaks like grasping fingers. It was Hurin who first noticed the change in the blade that Dunedain bore. "My lord," said he, as they made camp in the lee of a great stone that had once been part of a watchtower of the North Kingdom, "the sword at your side has grown dark indeed. When first you drew it in the vaults beneath Minas Tirith, its blade gleamed with silver tracery. Yet now that silver is tarnished, and the metal seems to drink in the light rather than reflect it." Indeed, it was so. Anglachel hung heavy at Dunedain's side, and though he had not drawn it from its sheath since leaving Rivendell, he could feel its presence like a weight upon his spirit. In quiet moments, when the wind stilled and his companions spoke not, he could hear its song continuing, no longer the clear note of challenge it sung in the chamber beneath Minas Tirith, but something darker, more complex, shot through with harmonies that spoke of ancient grief and unassuaged wrath. That night, as his companions slept about the dying embers of their fire, Dunedain walked apart and drew the blade beneath the light of stars. Black it was indeed, blacker than the depths of Moria, and along its edge ran not silver tracery, but lines of deep red, as though the very metal wept tears of blood. Yet for all its dark aspect, the blade was wondrously keen, and when he tested its edge upon a fallen branch, it cut through the wood as easily as though it were but parchment. "Beautiful, is it not?" came a voice from the darkness, and Dunedain spun about with the sword raised, though he could see naught but shadows dancing in the mist. "Who speaks?" he demanded, though in his heart he knew already, for it was the same voice that had addressed him from the ruins of the tower. "One who knew that blade ere thy grandfather's grandfather drew breath," came the reply, and now the voice seemed to come from all about him, as though the very darkness spoke. "I am called by many names, but in the tongues of the Eldar I was known as Thuringwethil, and in the days of Morgoth's power I served as herald and messenger to the Iron Crown." At the speaking of that name, Anglachel sang loud and sweet, and its blade began to glow with a light that was neither fair nor foul, but something between the two. For Thuringwethil had been mighty among the servants of the Dark Lord, a creature of shadow and flame who had taken the form of a great bat and soared above the hosts of Angband in the elder days. "You are destroyed," said Dunedain, though his voice trembled as he spoke. "Luthien Tinuviel herself tore the fell raiment from your spirit, and in the breaking of Thangorodrim, your form was dissolved." Laughter echoed through the mist, cold and bitter as winter wind. "Destroyed? Nay, young king, merely diminished. For I was bound to Anglicel in the forging, my essence wrought into its very metal by Eol's arts. Every stroke of that blade in battle feeds me. Every drop of blood it spills restores my strength. And now, after long ages of waiting, I am near to wholeness once more." Then did the truth of his peril dawn upon Dunedain with the force of revelation. Anglichel was no mere weapon of war, but a prison in which was bound the spirit of one of Morgoth's most terrible servants. And he, in his pride and desire for power to face the growing darkness, had become its bearer and unwitting ally. "Yet why do you reveal yourself to me?" he asked, backing toward the light of the dying fire where his companions lay sleeping. "If you seek to escape your bonds, would it not serve you better to remain hidden?" "Because, O heir of Isildur," came the voice, now sweet as honey and terrible as poison, "I have no wish to escape. The world has grown small and tame since the passing of my master, and I find myself lonely. Yet in you, I sense a spirit kindred to my own, proud, ambitious, willing to pay any price for power. Together we might accomplish great things, you and I. Together we might restore the glory that has departed from Middle-earth." At these words, Anglical's song grew so loud that it woke Hurin and the others, and they leaped to their feet with weapons in hand, thinking their lord was under attack. Yet when they looked upon him standing in the mist, with the black blade ablaze in his hand, they knew not whether to aid him or flee from him, for there was that in his aspect which was both terrible and beautiful to behold. "My lord," called Elladan, approaching with cautious steps, "what evil has befallen thee? The sword burns with darkness, and thy face is changed." With effort that cost him dear, Dunedain mastered himself and sheathed the blade, though it went not easily into its scabbard, but seemed to resist his will. "It is nothing," said he, though his voice rang hollow in his own ears, "a vision of the night no more. Let us break camp and press on, for I sense that our journey's end draws near." Yet, as they rode forth in the gray light of dawn, Hurin the Tall marked well how his lord's hand ever strayed to the hilt of the black sword, and how at times his lips moved as though he held converse with one unseen. And the captain began to fear that the weapon they had hoped would be their salvation might prove instead to be their doom. 3 days more they rode through the gathering gloom, and with each league that passed northward, the corruption of the land grew more manifest. Trees that should have been green with spring growth stood leafless and black, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt the eye to behold. Streams that had once run clear now flowed thick and dark, and no bird sang in all that desolate realm. Yet it was not the blight upon the land alone that troubled the hearts of the company, but the change that had come upon their leader. Where once Dunedain had been quick to laugh and free with counsel, now he rode in brooding silence, speaking only when necessity demanded. His eyes, which had been clear as gray rain, now held depths that seemed to swirl with shadow, and ever his hand rested upon the hilt of Anglichel, as though he feared it might be taken from him. The blade itself had grown stranger still. In daylight, it seemed to drink in the very light of the sun, leaving a wake of shadow wherever it passed. But in the darkness of night, it glowed with that eerie radiance, and its song had become a constant whisper at the edge of hearing, speaking words in tongues that had been old when the Eldar first came to Middle-earth. It was Elrohir who first dared to speak of what all had observed. "My lord Dunedain," said he, as they paused to rest at midday in the shadow of a great stone circle that had once been sacred to the Edain, "will you not tell us what passes between you and the blade you bear? For it seems to us that you hold converse with it, and that its voice grows ever stronger, while yours grows ever more distant. Dunedain turned upon him eyes that seemed to hold fires from the depths of the earth. What passes between Anglichel and me is no concern of yours, Elf Lord, said he, and his voice carried an edge that had not been there before. The blade was given to me by right, and I shall wield it as I see fit. Peace, kinsman, said Hurin, seeking to ease the sudden tension that had fallen upon them. Lord Elrohir speaks from concern for your welfare, as do we all. The sword is mighty indeed, but what? Dunedain's voice cracked like a whip. Would you have me cast aside the one weapon that might avail against the evil we go to face? Would you see us ride unarmed into the teeth of darkness? That is not what we counsel, replied Elladan with gentle firmness. Yet we fear that the cure you have chosen may prove worse than the disease. The blade has a will of its own, brother, and that will may not be bent to serve the cause of light. For a moment, it seemed that Dunedain might draw the sword upon his own companion, and all held their breath in fear. Yet then, the moment passed, and something of his old self returned to his eyes. Forgive me, said he, passing a hand across his brow. The road has been long and the burden heavy. I spoke in haste and anger. Yet though his words were of reconciliation, all could see that the peace between them was but a thin veneer over depths of growing darkness. And Anglichel at his side hummed with what might have been satisfaction. On the fourth day, they came at last within sight of Fornost Irain, the ancient capital of Arthedain and chief citadel of the northern kingdom. Once it had been called Norbury of the Kings, and its towers had risen proud and fair above the green hills of Eriador. But that was in the days when the blood of Numenor ran strong in the veins of its lord, and the realm of Arnor stretched from the misty mountains to the sea. Now ruin lay upon the ancient city like a shroud. Its walls were broken and overgrown with thorn and briar, its towers cast down or left to lean at perilous angle. In the streets that had once echoed with the voices of merchants and craftsmen, now only silence reigned, broken only by the mournful sigh of wind through empty doorways. Yet it was not the mere ruin of time and weather that they beheld, for there was that about the broken stones which spoke of violence and malice. The very air above the city shimmered with heat haze, though the day was cool, and from the deepest part of the ruins came a red glow that pulsed like the beating of some vast heart. Here lies the source of the evil, said Elladan, his fair face grave with foreboding. Can you not feel it? How the very foundations of the earth cry out in anguish? Some great wrong has been done in this place, some binding that was meant to endure until the end of the world has been broken. Anglichel sang loud and wild at Dunedain's side, and now its voice was no longer but harsh, discordant, like the clash of weapons in a battle where no quarter was given. The red light from the ruins seemed to answer its call, pulsing brighter with each note. Come, said Dunedain, and his voice was strange to hear, deeper than before and shot through with harmonics that spoke of vast spaces beneath the earth. Let us go down into the city and see what waits for us there, for I think our wait is ended, and the hour of trial is at hand. Thus they rode down from the hills into the ruins of Fornost, and with each step the sense of oppression grew stronger, until it seemed the very air had weight enough to crush them. Behind them, the sun dimmed and went out, though no cloud passed before its face, and ahead the red glow beckoned like a beacon in the dark. And in the depths of the ruins, something that had slept for long ages stirred and began to wake. Into the heart of Fornost Irain they rode, their horses' hooves ringing hollow upon stones that had once echoed with the tread of kings. The red glow that pulsed from the city's heart grew ever brighter as they advanced, until it seemed they rode through corridors lit by forge fire. Yet no warmth came from that light, but rather a cold that bit deeper than winter wind and left their breath hanging in the air like mist. The streets of the ancient city wound in patterns that seemed to shift and change as they watched, leading them ever inward toward the source of that fell radiance. Houses that had once sheltered the great and noble of Arthedain gaped like empty eye sockets, their windows dark and their doorways hung with shadow. From some came sounds that might have been weeping, from others laughter that spoke of madness beyond cure. Yet it was not the ruins themselves that filled the hearts of the company with dread, but what they saw moving among them. Shapes that had once been men walked the broken streets, but the flesh had long since fallen from their bones, and in the empty hollows of their skulls burned points of red fire that tracked their passage with malevolent intelligence. These were the Barrow-wights of old made manifest in the ruins of the city, animated by the same dark power that pulsed from the heart of Fornos. "The dead walk," whispered Hurin, his sword naked in his hand, though he knew not what use blade of common steel might serve against such foes. "The very stones weep with corruption, and the darkness has given form to shadow." Anglachel sang at Dunedain's side, and its voice had changed once more. No longer harsh and discordant, it now rang sweet and clear as a silver bell. And at its sound the walking dead fell back, pressing themselves against the walls as though they feared to come within reach of its edge. For the blade knew its ancient enemies, and they knew it in turn. "Fear them not," said Dunedain, and his voice carried a note of command that brooked no disobedience. "They are but servants of a greater will, shadows given form by power that flows from deeper sources. Our true enemy waits ahead, in the place where once the kings of Arnor held their court." Through the winding streets they pressed, past fountains that ran with black water and gardens where only thorns and poison flowers grew. Ever the red light beckoned them onward, until at last they came to the great square that lay before the ruins of the royal palace. Here had the kings of Arthedain held court in the days of their glory, when the realm stretched wide and the blood of the West was undimmed by defeat. But now the palace was a ruin more complete than any they had yet seen. Its walls melted and twisted into shapes that defied both nature and art. From its broken halls came that pulsing red glow, and with it a sound like the beating of some vast heart buried deep in the earth. The very air shimmered with heat that had no source in flame or fire, but came rather from energies that belonged to the foundations of the world. In the center of the square stood a throne carved from black stone, and upon that throne sat a figure that had once been a man. Tall he was and fair of face, clad in robes that had once been white, but were now stained with blood and shadow. Upon his brow sat a crown of iron wrought in the likeness of serpents, and in his hand he bore a staff of black wood that seemed to drink in the light of the red glow. "Welcome, heir of Isildur," said the figure, rising from his throne with fluid grace. "Long have I waited for thy coming, for the prophecies spoke true when they said that one would come bearing Anglachel in the hour of my awakening. I am called the Mouth of Sauron no longer, for my master has passed beyond the circles of the world. Now I am master in my own right, and the name men shall know me by is Morgomir the Black." At the speaking of that name, Anglachel leaped from its sheath as though it moved of its own will, and its blade blazed with light that challenged the red glow from the ruin. For Morgomir had indeed been the Mouth of Sauron in the days of the War of the Ring, but when his master fell, he had fled north to the ruins of Angband, there to delve deep into the secrets of the Iron Crown. "You were cast down with your master," said Dunedain, though he had to fight to control the blade that writhed in his grip like a living thing. "How come you to stand again beneath the sky?" Laughter rang from the throne, cold and beautiful and terrible to hear. "Cast down? Nay, O king of a fallen line, I was freed, for when the Barad-dûr fell and the One Ring was unmade, all the bonds that held the ancient powers in check were loosened. I delved deep beneath the ruins of Thangorodrim, and there I found that which Morgoth hid before his overthrow, a fragment of his very essence, bound into the substance of the earth itself." "Impossible," breathed Elladan. "The Valar themselves cast down the Iron Crown and bound its power beyond the doors of night." "See, the Valar bound what they could perceive," replied Morgomir with a smile that held no warmth. "But Morgoth was cunning beyond their measure, and he prepared for defeat as surely as others prepare for victory. The fragment waits still in the depths, sleeping, but I have found the key to wake it. All I require is a vessel strong enough to contain its power, and a blade mighty enough to break the final seal. Then did the truth fall upon Dunedain like a blow, and he staggered beneath the weight of understanding. "Anglachel," he whispered, "you mean to use Anglachel to free the essence of Morgoth?" "Not I alone," said Morgomir, extending his hand toward the sword that blazed at Dunedain's side. "We shall do it together, thou and I and the spirit that dwells within the blade. For Thuringwethil has whispered in thy dreams, has she not? She has shown thee visions of power and glory, of a world remade according to thy will. All this can be thine, if thou wilt but take the final step." Anglachel sang wild and sweet, and in its voice Dunedain heard the promise of all he had ever desired: dominion over the kingdoms of men, the power to remake Middle-earth as he saw fit, the strength to cast down all who opposed him. The blade turned in his hand as though it sought to pull him forward, and for a moment it seemed he might yield to its call. But then he heard another voice, faint but clear beneath the sword's dark song, the voice of Hurin calling his name, and the voices of his companions crying out in warning. He looked and saw them struggling against bonds of shadow that had sprung up from the very stone, their weapons useless against the power that held them fast. "Choose," said Morgomir, and his voice was soft as silk and sharp as broken glass. "The blade or thy friend, power or sentiment, the future or the past." And in that moment of choice, as Anglachel sang loud enough to shake the very foundations of the earth, Dunedain made his decision. The sword sang like the voice of stars being born, and in its music, Dunedain heard the echo of choices made long ago in the darkness beneath the mountain. For he saw now the trap that had been laid, not merely for him, but for all his line since the day Isildur took the ring from Sauron's hand. Each generation had been offered the same choice: power beyond measure, or the harder path of sacrifice for the sake of others. "I choose neither," said Dunedain, and his voice rang clear across the square, despite the wild song of Anglachel. "For thou speakest of choice, as though it were between two things only, when in truth there is always a third path, the path of those who would rather break than bend." With strength that came not from his body, but from his spirit, he raised the black blade high above his head. Anglachel shrieked in protest, its voice rising to a pitch that cracked the stones beneath their feet and sent the waiting wights fleeing into the darkness. For the blade knew what he intended, and it fought him with all the will that Eöl had wrought into its making. "Fool!" cried Morgomir, rising from his throne with staff upraised. "Wouldst thou destroy the greatest weapon ever forged? Without Anglachel, thou art powerless. A hedge knight with pretensions to kingship, perhaps," replied Dunedain through gritted teeth. For the struggle with the blade was like wrestling with a demon of fire and shadow. But better a powerless king than a powerful slave. Red light blazed from Morgomir's staff, and the very air caught fire as powers older than the sun crashed together in the square. The shadows that held Dunedain's companions began to writhe and twist, and from their depths came the sound of Thuringwethil's voice, no longer sweet, but filled with malice beyond measure. "Fool, fool, 10,000 years have I waited for this moment, 10,000 years of imprisonment in this cursed blade. Wouldst thou cast away dominion over all Middle-earth for the sake of sentiment?" "I would," said Dunedain, and brought Anglachel down upon the stone of Morgomir's throne with all his strength. The black blade met the black stone, and the world went white with light that had no source in any earthly fire. Thunder rolled across the square, and the very foundations of Fornost shook as though the earth itself cried out in pain. From the ruins of the palace came a howling that spoke of things bound since the world's making, suddenly set free, and the red glow that had pulsed from its depths went out like a candle in a hurricane. When sight returned to them, they saw that Anglachel lay broken upon the shattered throne, its blade snapped in twain, and its dark light quenched forever. But of Thuringwethil there was no sign, for her spirit had been bound to the sword by bonds that could not survive its breaking. As the blade died, so did she pass away into darkness, her voice fading on the wind like the cry of a night bird at dawn. Morgomir stood amid the wreckage of his throne, and the crown of iron had fallen from his brow to lie twisted upon the stone. No longer did he seem tall and fair, but only a man grown old in the service of darkness, his power broken with the breaking of the blade. "Thou hast doomed us all," he whispered, and in his voice was neither anger nor malice, but only a great weariness. "The fragment sleeps still beneath the mountain, but it will not sleep forever, and when it wakes, there will be no sword of power to stand against it. Then we shall find another way," said Dunedain, though he swayed upon his feet like a man who has run beyond his strength. For that is what kings are for, to find hope where others see only despair. The shadows that had bound his companions melted away like morning mist, and they came to him with joy and relief written upon their faces. Yet as they embraced him and spoke words of praise for his courage, Dunedain felt only the weight of the choice he had made, for he knew that in breaking Anglichel, he had indeed cast away power that might have served the cause of light, and that the road ahead would be harder for its loss. "Come," said Hurin, supporting his lord as they made their way from the square, "let us away from this accursed place, for I think the danger is not ended, but only changed." Indeed, as they rode from the ruins of Fornost in the grey light of dawn, they could feel the earth trembling beneath their horses' hooves. For deep beneath the misty mountain, in caverns that had been sealed since the breaking of Thangorodrim, something stirred in its sleep and began to dream of vengeance. And in those dreams, the fragment of Morgoth's essence that Morgomir had found began to sing a new song, not of immediate awakening, but of patience and planning, and the slow corruption of all things that the broken blade had once promised to protect. In the halls of Rivendell, the wise gathered to hear the tale of Dunedain's journey into the north, and of the breaking of Anglichel upon the throne of Shadow. There sat Elrond, master of the house, though his sight had dimmed with the passing years, and beside him his sons Elladan and Elrohir, who had witnessed the deed with their own eyes. Glorfindel the golden-haired was there, and Erestor the counselor, and others of the Noldor whose names were remembered in song. From the Grey Havens had come Círdan the shipwright, bearing word from across the sea, and from the depths of Fangorn Forest came news carried by the Entwive, who alone of their kind had survived the wrath of Saruman. Even from distant Lothlorien came representatives of the Galadrim, for the breaking of such a blade of power had sent ripples through all the circles of the world. "Evil indeed was thy choice," spoke Elrond when the tale was done, "yet evil would have been any choice thou mightest have made. For Anglichel was wrought in malice, and no good could have come from its continued use, no matter how noble the intent of its bearer. Yet now we are left defenseless," said Erestor with troubled voice. "The fragment of Morgoth's essence sleeps still beneath the mountain, but it will not sleep forever. And when it wakes, what weapons shall we bear against it? The great swords of the elder days are no more. Orcrist lies in the tomb of Thorin Oakenshield. Sting has passed beyond the sea with its bearer, and now Anglichel is broken beyond repair. Not all the weapons of power have passed from the world," said Círdan, his ancient voice carrying the weight of years beyond counting. "In the Grey Haven lie things saved from the rack of Numenor, and in the House of Elrond are treasures that came out of Gondolin in the days of its fall. Yet none of these would avail against the darkness that stirs beneath the earth." Then spoke Glorfindel, who alone among them had looked upon the face of a Balrog and lived to tell the tale. "There is one weapon that might serve, though it lies beyond our reach. In the Undying Land, in the halls of Manwë upon Tanicatil, is kept Aeglos, the spear of Gil-galad. With that weapon he fought Sauron himself upon the slopes of Mount Doom, and though he fell in the victory, the spear endured. The spear is beyond the circles of the world," said Elrond with finality. "We who remain in Middle-earth may not call upon the aid of the Valar, for the time of their direct intervention is past." A silence fell upon the council then, heavy with the weight of despair, for it seemed to all that they faced a doom against which no earthly power could avail, and that the sacrifice made at Fornost had gained them only a brief respite from inevitable defeat. It was then that Dunedain spoke, who had sat silent through all their debate. "Masters," said he, "in all your councils you speak of weapons wrought by others, of powers that lie beyond our grasp. Yet what of that which lies within ourselves? What of the light that burns in the hearts of the free peoples, which no darkness has ever wholly quenched?" "Pretty words," replied Erestor with some heat, "but words will not serve against the fragment of Morgoth's malice when it wakes in power." "Will they not?" Dunedain rose from his seat, and though he bore no weapon of power, there was that in his bearing which spoke of kingship. "Tell me, masters of lore, how was Morgoth defeated in the beginning? Was it by sword alone, or by something greater?" "By the host of the Valor," answered Elrond, "and by the light of the two trees ere they were darkened." "Aye, but before that," pressed Dunedain, "in the beginning, when the world was young, and Morgoth first sought to claim dominion over all things, what was it that held him back?" Glorfindel's eyes kindled with sudden understanding. "The music of the Ainur," he whispered, "the song of creation, which Eru Ilúvatar made the foundation of all things." "Even so," said Dunedain with a smile, "and that music plays still in the hearts of all who would stand against the shadow. Every deed of courage, every word of hope, every choice to help rather than harm, all these are notes in the great song that shapes the world, and if we can sing that song loud enough and true enough, it might serve to keep the fragment sleeping," finished Círdan, wonder growing in his ancient eyes, "not for all time, but perhaps long enough for hope to find another way." "More than that," said Dunedain, his voice growing stronger as the vision took shape in his mind. "For if the song is sung by all the free peoples together, elves and men and dwarves and halflings, and all who would see the light endure, then it might do more than hold the darkness at bay. It might transform it, as gold is transformed in the refining fire." But even as hope began to kindle in their hearts, news came from the north that cast a shadow over their council. A messenger arrived, travel-worn and bearing ill tidings from the lands beyond the misty mountain. "My lords," gasped, falling to his knees before the assembled council, "I bring word from the rangers who keep watch upon the northern borders. The fragment stirs beneath the mountain, and its dreams are growing stronger. The very beasts of the wild flee southward, and the sky above the peaks burns with unnatural fire. And there is worse news still. Morgomir the Black has not perished as we hoped, but has fled into the deep places of the earth, where he gathers to himself all manner of dark creatures that dwelt in shadow since the world's making. Then did all their hope seem to crumble, for if Morgomir yet lived and was gathering power, then the danger was greater than they had imagined. The council dissolved in confusion and despair, each seeking his own people to prepare for the storm that must come. Yet Dunedain remained in Rivendell, and in the days that followed, he spent long hours in thought and prayer, seeking wisdom for the trials ahead. And sometimes, in the still hours before dawn, he seemed to hear a music that had no earthly source, the echo of that first song which made the world, calling him to take up a burden greater than any sword. As autumn deepened into winter, in the year following the breaking of Anglishel, the signs of awakening darkness multiplied beyond all doubt. From the misty mountains came reports of avalanches that fell upward rather than down, and of peaks that glowed with inner fire, though no volcano had ever burned there. The very stones of the earth cracked and groaned as though some vast weight pressed upon them from below. In Rivendell, Dunedain had spent the months since the council in study of the ancient lore, seeking in the writings of the Eldar some clue to the nature of the threat they faced. Day by day, the libraries of Elrond revealed their secrets to him. Scrolls saved from the wreck of Númenor, fragments of the Annals of the King, and most precious of all, a portion of the Red Book that told of the music of the Ainur in the words of Bilbo Baggins himself. Yet for all his study, the path remained unclear. How could mortal men hope to sing with such power as to bind the essence of a fallen Vala? How could their voices, however true, compare to the music that shaped the very foundations of the world? It was Elrond who brought him the answer, though it came in a form he had not expected. The Elf Lord entered the Hall of Fire, where Dunedain sat reading, and in his hands he bore a harp of silver wrought in the workshops of Eregion in the days before their fall. "Long has this lain silent," said Elrond, setting the instrument upon the table before him. "It was made by Celebrimbor, ere he fell to Sauron's treachery, and into its making went all his skill in the working of mithril and song. With this harp Gil-galad would play in the hours before battle, and it is said that its music could heal the wounds of the spirit as surely as the hands of kings could heal the hurts of the flesh." Dunedain touched the string, and at once a note of impossible sweetness filled the hall. Yet beneath that sweetness lay something more, a resonance that seemed to touch the very foundations of the world, as though the harp were tuned not merely to the scales of earthly music, but to the deeper harmony that shaped all things. "I understand," whispered Dunedain, as the note faded into silence. "The music we need is not ours to create, but ours to channel. We must become instruments ourselves, allowing the song of creation to play through us, as it once played through the Ainur in the beginning." "Even so," replied Elrond with grave joy, "yet such music cannot be played by one alone, no matter how pure his intent. It requires a choir of many voices, each singing in harmony with the others, each adding its own note to the greater theme." "Then let us gather such a choir," said Dunedain, rising with sudden resolution. "Let messengers go forth to all the free peoples of Middle-earth, summoning them to a great gathering. Not an army of swords and spears, but an army of voices raised in common cause." Through the winter months, the messengers rode, carrying word of the gathering to every corner of Middle-earth. To Minas Tirith went Hurin the Tall, bearing letters sealed with the sign of Isildur, to King Elisar and the lords of Gondor. To the Shire went others, seeking the hobbits whose courage had once saved the world. To the lonely mountain rode swift horses, bearing word to Dane Ironfoot and the lords of the dwarves. Even to distant Rhûn and Harad went the call, for the shadow that threatened them touched all lands alike. Yet it was not only the great and mighty who heard the summons. In villages and farmsteads, in the halls of simple folk who had never dreamed of glory, the word spread that all who would stand against the darkness were welcome. For Dunedain had learned from his study of the ancient lore that the music of creation was not the province of the wise alone, but flowed through all living things that chose light over shadow. As spring returned to Middle-earth, they began to come. From Gondor came a host of knights and men-at-arms, but with them came minstrels and musicians, bards and singers, whose voices had been trained in the halls of the citadel. From the Shire came not only the bold and adventurous, but families entire, for the hobbits understood in their simple wisdom that such a task required not heroes alone, but the ordinary courage of ordinary folk. The dwarves came down from their mountain halls, and with them they brought instruments of their own making, horns carved from dragon bone, and drums that thundered like the forges of their fathers. From the woodland realms came the elves, bearing harps and flutes that sang of starlight and growing things. Even from the distant east came wandering minstrels and philosophers, drawn by rumors of a music that might heal the wounds of the world. They gathered in the valley of Rivendell, and their numbers swelled until the hidden valley could scarce contain them all. Yet there was no discord among them, for all had come in answer to the same call, all united in the common purpose of standing against the darkness that threatened to engulf them all. It was on the first day of summer that the final messenger arrived, and the tidings he bore cast a pall over all their preparation. From the north he came, riding a horse that was near dead with exhaustion, and his face was drawn with terror at what he had seen. "My lords," cried he, falling from his saddle at the feet of the assembled leaders, The mountain breaks, the fragment wakes, and its voice shakes the very roots of the world. Even now does Morgomir gather his host in the deeps, and creatures unseen since the elder days answer his call. The earth bleeds fire, and the sky weeps tears of stone. Then did all know that the time of preparation was ended, and the hour of trial was at hand. For in the distance, beyond the misty mountains, they could see a red glow spreading across the northern sky, and the very air trembled with the sound of vast powers stirring beneath the earth. "Tomorrow we sing," said Dunedain, his voice carrying to every corner of the valley. "Tomorrow we raise our voices in the song that shaped the world, and we shall see whether the music of the free peoples can stand against the discord of the shadow." Yet even as he spoke, he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing upon his heart, for they were about to attempt something that had never been tried before, to wield the very music of creation as a weapon against the darkness. And if they failed, not only would their own lives be forfeit, but the fragment of Morgoth's essence would wake to spread its malice across all the world. Dawn came gray and troubled to the valley of Rivendell, and with it came signs and portents that filled the hearts of all with foreboding. The very air seemed thick and hard to breathe, and the leaves on the trees hung motionless, though a wind was stirring that could be felt, but not seen. From the north came a sound like distant thunder, but it did not fade as thunder should, but grew ever stronger and more insistent. In the center of the valley, where once the sons of Elrond had trained in the arts of war, now stood a great circle of white stones brought down from the heights of the mountain. Within that circle were gathered all who would take part in the great song, not merely the skilled musicians and trained singers, but all who had answered the call, from the mightiest lords to the humblest farmer. For Dunedain had learned from his study of the lore that the song of creation drew its power not from skill alone, but from the united will of all who would stand against the shadow. At the center of the circle stood the heir of Isildur, bearing in his hands the silver harp of Gil-galad. Around him were ranged the greatest musicians of each of the free people: Lindir of the elves with his golden flute, Ori, son of Ori, with his horn of mountain silver, Milo Burrows of the Shire, his simple wooden pipe, and many others whose names would be remembered in song if their deeds succeeded. Yet for all their numbers and all their preparation, doubt gnawed at the hearts of many. How could mortal voices, however true, hope to match the power that had shaped the very foundations of the world? How could they sing with such force as to bind the essence of a fallen Vala to sleep once more? It was Elrond who spoke the answer, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathering. "Fear not, children of the music," said he, "for the power we seek to wield is not our own. We are but instruments through which the true song may sound, channels for the harmony that flows from the source of all things. Let each sing not with his own voice alone, but with the voice of all that he loves, all that he would preserve from the shadow. For love is the strongest power in all the circles of the world, and against it no darkness can long endure." Then did Dunedain raise the silver harp, and at his touch its strings began to sing with a note that seemed to come from the very heart of creation. Soft it was at first, no louder than the whisper of wind through leaves, but in it was a purity that made all who heard it remember the first time they had looked upon beauty and known it for what it was. One by one, the other instruments joined in. First, the flute of Lindir, adding a melody bright as starlight. Then the horn of Ori with its deep note that spoke of mountains and enduring stone. The pipe of Milo Burrows sang of green fields and gardens, of simple joys and quiet contentment. From every quarter of the circle came new voices, each adding its own thread to the growing tapestry of sound. Yet it was not until the singers joined their voices to the instruments that the true power of the music began to manifest. For as the song swelled and grew, it seemed to take on a life of its own, echoing not merely in the air, but in the very stones beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. The earth itself began to sing, and the mountains added their ancient voices to the chorus. From the north came an answering sound, not music, but its opposite, a discord that spoke of chaos and destruction, of the unmaking of all ordered things. The very air caught fire as the two powers met and clashed, and lightnings danced between the peaks of the misty mountains like the swords of giants at war. "Sing!" cried Dunedain, his voice somehow carrying over the growing tumult. "Sing of all that you love, all that you would save. Let the music of your hearts join with the song that shaped the world." In the north, the mountain that held the fragment of Morgoth's essence began to crack and blaze, and from its depths came shapes of shadow and flame that had not walked Middle-earth since the days when Thangorodrim stood in its pride. At their head came Morgomir the Black, grown tall and terrible in his malice, and in his hand he bore a staff crowned with a star of black fire. Too late, his voice rang across the valleys, magnified by powers dark and fell. Too late do the children of Iluvatar seek to raise their feeble voices against the darkness. The fragment wakes, and with it wakes the power to unmake all the music that has ever been. Yet even as he spoke, the song from Rivendell grew stronger still, and now all could hear within it harmonies that no earthly throat could produce. For the music had caught the attention of powers greater than those that walked Middle-earth, and from across the sea came voices to join the chorus, the voices of those who had passed into the undying lands, adding their strength to the song of the living. The very fabric of the world began to resonate with the music, and colors undreamed of by mortal eyes painted themselves across the sky. In the waters of Bruinen, images formed and faded, glimpses of other times and other places, where the song of creation had sounded in its fullness. For a moment, that seemed to last an age. All who sang were caught up in a vision of the world as it had been in the beginning, when all was new and fair and unmarred by shadow. But Morgomir was not without power of his own, and the fragment of Morgoth's essence lent strength to his discord. The mountain split asunder with a roar that shook the roots of the world, and from its heart came a pillar of flame that reached from earth to sky. In that flame were shapes that hurt the eye to look upon, the forms of creatures that had served the first Dark Lord in the days of his power, now called back from whatever abyss had held them. The song from Rivendell wavered, as many faltered in fear at the sight of such terrors. Yet Dunedain's voice rose above the discord, clear and strong as a silver bell, and the harp in his hands blazed with light that was neither fire nor star, but something between the two. "Fear them not," he sang, and his words became part of the music itself. "They are but shadows of shadows, echoes of powers that have already been defeated. The song that shaped the world shall not be silenced by the rage of those who would unmake it." Then did something unexpected happen, something that neither Morgomir nor any other had foreseen. For as the song reached its crescendo, as 10,000 voices joined in harmony that touched the very foundations of creation, the discord from the north began to change. Note by note, the chaotic shrieking of the fragment was caught up in the greater melody, transformed from destruction to harmony as a smith transforms raw ore into finest steel. The very essence of Morgoth's malice, freed from its prison of stone and flame, found itself drawn into the music that it had sought to destroy. For such was the nature of the song of creation that nothing could truly stand against it. Even evil itself could be transformed and redeemed if the harmony was pure enough and strong enough. Morgomir cried out in dismay as he felt his master's power slipping from his grasp, turned from weapon to instrument of the very force he had sought to overthrow. The creatures of shadow that had answered his call began to dissolve like mist before the sun, their forms unable to maintain coherence in the face of such overwhelming harmony. Yet the song was not finished, for there remained one final movement to be played out, the moment when the transformed essence of Morgoth's malice would be given its new purpose in the symphony of creation. As the song of creation reached its moment of greatest power, the very nature of reality seemed to bend and flow like water. The pillar of flame that had risen from the broken mountain began to change, its red light softening to gold, then to silver, then to a radiance that had no name in any earthly tongue. Within that light, all could see the fragment of Morgoth's essence writhing and transforming, its malice being slowly transmuted into something altogether different. Morgomir the Black stood in the center of his ruined fortress, his staff of power crumbling to ash in his hands as the forces he had sought to command turned against him. No longer tall and terrible, he seemed to shrink upon himself until he appeared as nothing more than a mortal man who had lived too long in the service of darkness and now faced the reckoning of his choices. "This cannot be!" he cried, his voice breaking like a child's. "The fragment was bound by chains of adamant. It cannot be turned from its purpose." But even as he spoke, those who watched from Rivendell could see that his words were false, for the song had reached depths that no chain could touch, harmonies that resonated with the very core of being itself. The fragment of Morgoth's essence, for all its malice, was still part of the music that Eru Ilúvatar had sung in the beginning. And like all things that had their source in that first song, it could be healed and made whole again. From the transformed pillar of light came a voice that was both terrible and beautiful to hear, the voice of power learning humility, of pride discovering wisdom, of hatred being slowly consumed by an understanding too vast for any mortal mind to grasp. It spoke no words that living ears could comprehend, but its meaning was clear to all who heard. The ancient malice was acknowledging its defeat, not by force of arms, but by the greater force of love. In Rivendell, the singers felt the music change around them, becoming something both simpler and more complex than anything they had attempted before. No longer were they singing to bind or transform an enemy, but to welcome a lost child back into the harmony from which it had so long been separated. The song became a lullaby, gentle and healing, washing away the accumulated pain and anger of ages beyond. Dunedain felt the silver harp in his hands grow warm, then cool, then warm again, as though it too were being transformed by the music that flowed through it. The strings sang with notes that seemed to come from the very heart of creation, and he knew that he was no longer merely playing the instrument, but had become part of it, a living channel through which the song of the Ainur could manifest in the world. One by one, the creatures of shadow that had answered Morgomir's call began to change as well. The Balrogs of the ancient days, whose forms had been twisted by long service to darkness, felt their fires cool and their malice fade, until they stood revealed as the mire they had been in the beginning, spirits of flame and light who had forgotten their true nature. The orcs and goblins, whose minds had been poisoned by generations of cruelty, found their thoughts clearing as the music washed away the accumulated hate and fear that had driven them. Even the very stones of the broken mountain began to sing, adding their ancient voices to the growing chorus. For they remembered the time before Morgoth's shadow had fallen upon them, when they had been part of the foundations of the world that Eru had sung into being. Now they rejoiced to feel that original harmony flowing through them once again. Yet it was not merely the great and terrible powers that were transformed by the song. In villages throughout Middle-earth, in the hearts of simple folk who had gathered to listen to the music carried on the wind, changes both small and profound began to manifest. Old grudges were forgotten, ancient wounds began to heal, and enemies who had fought for generations found themselves weeping as they embraced in reconciliation. For this was the true power of the Song of Creation, not to destroy evil, but to transform it, to show it what it might become if it chose a different path. Even Morgomir himself, standing alone in the ruins of his ambition, felt the music working its changes upon his heart. The pride and bitterness that had driven him for so long began to crack and crumble, revealing beneath them a pain so deep and old that he had forgotten its source. In that moment of revelation, he saw himself as he truly was, not a dark lord conquering the world, but a lost soul who had wandered so far from the light that he had forgotten the way home. The tears that flowed down his cheeks were the first he had shed in centuries, and in them was both sorrow for what he had become and hope for what he might yet be. The pillar of light that had risen from the mountain began to pulse in rhythm with the music, and all who watched could see that it was no longer a thing of earth and flame, but something else entirely, a beacon that reached from the world to the very gates of Valinor, carrying the transformed essence of Morgoth's malice to its final rest. As the song reached its conclusion, as the last notes faded into a silence that was not empty, but full of infinite possibility, the light began to fade as well. Yet its passing was not like the going out of a fire, but like the coming of dawn that makes all flames seem pale by comparison. For something had been accomplished that day that would echo through all the ages of the world, the transformation of the greatest evil into the purest good, the healing of a wound that had festered since the world's beginning. In the Valley of Rivendell, 10,000 voices fell silent, and in that silence was a peace deeper than any that had been known since the music of the Ainur first shaped the world. The silver harp in Dunedain's hands was still warm to the touch, but its strings were silent now, their work complete. Yet even as the singers rejoiced in their victory, they knew that the true test was yet to come. For the song had done more than simply defeat an enemy. It had changed the very nature of Middle-earth itself, opening doors that had been closed since the beginning of time, and setting in motion changes that would reshape the world in ways none could yet foresee. In the days that followed the great song, as the participants began to disperse from Rivendell back to their homes across Middle-earth, it became clear that the victory they had won came with a price none had anticipated. For the transformation of Morgoth's essence had indeed changed the nature of the world, but those changes brought with them consequences both wonderful and terrible. Dunedain was among the first to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. The silver harp of Gil-galad, which had blazed with inner light during the singing, now lay cold and silent in his hand. When he attempted to play it, no sound emerged from its strings, though they had not been broken. It was as though the instrument had given all of its music to the great song and had nothing left to offer. "It is the way of such thing," said Elrond, finding him in the Hall of Fire staring at the silent harp. "Great deeds require great sacrifice, and power, once spent in such a cause, does not return easily to its vessel." "I fear the silence goes deeper than a single instrument," replied Dunedain, setting the harp aside with gentle care. "Something has changed in me as well, some capacity for hearing the music that underlies all things. It is as though I have become deaf to harmonies that once rang clear as bells." Elrond nodded gravely, for he too had felt the change. "The song we sang drew upon wells of power that were never meant to be tapped by those who dwell within the circles of the world. We have performed a deed worthy of the Valar themselves, but at a cost that may take generations to fully understand." Reports came from across Middle-earth that confirmed their fears. In Gondor, the white tree that had bloomed eternal since the return of the king had begun to wither, its leaves falling like snow in summer, though no blight could be detected upon its branches. In the Shire, the springs that had always run clear and sweet now sometimes flowed bitter, and the fields that had never known failure yielded harvests strange and wild. Most troubling of all were the messages from the Grey Haven, where Círdan reported that the very sea itself had changed. The gulls that had always followed the white ships westward now wheeled in confusion, crying out as though they had lost their way. And from beyond the horizon came no answering songs from the undying lands, but only silence deeper than any that had been known since the world began. "We have sundered something," said Glorfindel, when the wise gathered once more to consider these tidings. "In transforming the fragment of Morgoth's essence, we have disrupted the very foundations upon which this age of the world was built. The music that held all things in their proper places has been altered." "Altered how?" asked Dunedain, though he dreaded the answer. "The boundaries grow thin," replied the golden-haired lord. "The walls between what is and what might be have been weakened by the power we unleash. Already there are reports of strange happenings, men who claim to see the past and future with equal clarity, beasts that speak with human voices, trees that uproot themselves to walk beneath the stars. It was then that the most disturbing news of all arrived, brought by a messenger who rode as though all the wolves of shadow were upon his heels. From the north he came, from the lands where the mountain had been split asunder by their song, and his tale chilled the hearts of all who heard it. "My lords," gasped he, falling from his horse at the gates of Rivendell, "the very earth bleeds with strangeness. Where once the fragment of Morgoth's malice burned in darkness beneath the mountain, now there grows a forest, unlike any that has been seen since the days of legend. The trees stretch higher than towers, and their leaves shine with all the colors of the rainbow. But that is not the strangest part." "Speak," commanded Elrond, though his voice trembled with foreboding. "The trees sing, my lord. They sing with voices like those we heard in the great song, but changed, transformed into something that is neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but something new. And those who hear their singing too long report that they begin to change as well, growing tall and strange, their eyes taking on colors that have no name." A great silence fell upon the assembled wise, for they began to understand the magnitude of what they had unleashed. In transforming the essence of Morgoth's malice, they had not merely defeated an enemy, they had created something entirely new, a force that followed neither the patterns of good nor evil as they had been established since the world's beginning. "What have we done?" whispered Dunedain, and in his voice was all the anguish of a king who sees his people suffering for his choices. "We have changed the world," replied Elrond simply. "Whether for good or ill, only time will tell. But know this, the age of certainty is ended. No longer may we look to the wisdom of the past to guide us, for we have stepped beyond the boundaries of all precedent. From this day forward, we must learn to live in a world where anything might be possible." As if to underscore his word, a new voice joined their council, a voice that seemed to come from the very air around them, speaking words in Quenya that rang with authority beyond measure. "Children of the music," it said, and all recognized the tone of one who had stood before the throne of Eru Ilúvatar himself. "Know that what you have done was foreseen from the beginning, written into the very themes of the great song before time began. You have brought about the end of the Third Age, not through conquest or cataclysm, but through transformation. The Fourth Age begins now, and it shall be an age unlike any that have come before, an age where the barriers between possibility and reality grow ever thinner, where new forms of life and thought shall flourish, and where the children of Ilúvatar must learn to be gardeners of wonder rather than warriors against shadows." The voice faded, leaving them in a silence pregnant with infinite possibility. For they understood now that their victory over the fragment of Morgoth's essence had been only the beginning, not the end. They had not saved the world from change. They had initiated a transformation so profound that the very nature of existence itself would never be the same. And in the heart of Dunedain, heir of the kings of old, there began to grow a new understanding of what it meant to be a ruler in such time. No longer could he govern by precedent and tradition alone. He must learn to guide his people through changes that no wisdom of the past could illuminate. The song had ended, but the music it had begun would play on through all the ages yet to come. 7 years had passed since the great song echoed across Middle-earth, and the world had settled into its new patterns like a river finding its course after a great storm. The strangeness that had first alarmed all who witnessed it had become simply the way of things, woven into the daily lives of the free peoples as naturally as sunrise and sunset. In Minas Tirith, King Elessar had passed into legend, and Dunedain now sat upon the throne of Gondor with a crown wrought not of gold but of silver that sang softly when the wind touched it. The citadel had grown in ways that defied all earthly architecture. Its towers now stretched both upward toward the stars and downward into realms that existed somewhere between dream and waking. From these depths came counselors whose forms shifted like mist, but whose wisdom was beyond question, for they had been born from the transformation of the old darkness into something entirely new. The white tree had not died as feared, but had transformed beyond all recognition. Its trunk now spiraled through dimensions that the eye could follow, but the mind could barely grasp. And its leaves showed not the green of growing things, but all the colors that existed, and some that did not. When the wind stirred its branches, which it did according to no earthly pattern, the tree sang fragments of the original song of creation, each note a glimpse into the infinite possibilities that lay dormant within the world. In the north, where the mountain had been split asunder, the singing forest had grown to cover lands that had once been barren stone and ice. Travelers who walked beneath its rainbow canopies spoke of wonders beyond description, clearings where time flowed backward, allowing glimpses of the elder days, pools that reflected not the sky above, but the dreams of those who looked into them, paths that led not merely to other places, but to other ways of being. The trees themselves had become something between plant and spirit, rooted in earth, but conscious in ways that challenged all understanding. They welcomed visitors with voices like wind chimes made of starlight, offering wisdom that could only be comprehended by those who had learned to think in harmonies rather than words. Some who stayed too long among them were changed, growing tall and strange as the messenger had warned. But those who returned spoke not of horror, but of transformation, of becoming more than they had been, part of a greater symphony that played through all living things. The other realms of Middle-earth had adapted to the new reality in their own ways. In the Shire, the hobbits had discovered that their gardens now grew plants from the depths of memory and dream, flowers that bloomed with the scent of childhood summers, vegetables that tasted of stories never told, herbs that could season a meal with the essence of distant lands the gardener had never seen. Far from being troubled by these changes, the hobbits embraced them with typical practicality, establishing a new trade in possibility produce that soon spread throughout the western land. The elves of Rivendell and Lothlorien found themselves faced with a choice they had not expected to make. The changes wrought by the Great Song had weakened the barriers between Middle-earth and the Undying Lands, making passage across the sea both easier and more dangerous. Some chose to sail west to rejoin their kindred, while others elected to remain, fascinated by the new forms of beauty and wonder that were emerging from the transformed world. It was these latter who established the new colleges of learning that sprang up across the continent, institutions dedicated not to preserving the wisdom of the past, but to discovering the possibilities of the future. Here, scholars who might once have been enemies worked side by side, former orcs whose minds had been cleared by the song's transformation, dragons who had awakened from the sleep of malice to find themselves possessed of curious intelligence, and even creatures that had no names in any earthly tongue, born from the intersection of dream and reality. Dunedain himself had become something more than a mere king, though he still bore that title for the comfort of those who needed familiar words. The harp of Gil-galad remained silent in his hands, but he had learned to hear the music that flowed through all things. Not the music of the Ainur exactly, but something new, a harmony born from the marriage of order and chaos, light and shadow, possibility and reality. From his throne in the transformed citadel, he could see across all the lands that acknowledged his rule, and beyond to places that existed in the spaces between what was and what might be. His subjects came to him not only with disputes of law and questions of governance, but with wonders that challenged the very nature of existence. Children born with memories of other lives, artists whose paintings showed scenes from worlds that had never been, poets whose words could literally reshape reality in small but significant ways. He judged these matters not by the precedents of law, but by the harmonies of the greater song, seeking always to guide the growing strangeness in directions that served the cause of joy rather than sorrow, wonder rather than fear. It was a new kind of kingship for a new kind of world, requiring wisdom that could not be learned from books, but had to be discovered fresh each day. As he sat in contemplation on the anniversary of the Great Song, watching the white tree sing its fragments of creation while the sun set behind mountains that now existed in several dimensions simultaneously, Dunedain reflected on the choice he had made in the ruins of Fornost so many years before. Breaking Anglekel had indeed cast away a great power, but it had opened the door to something far greater. Not the dominion of one will over others, but the liberation of all will to explore the infinite possibilities that lay hidden within the song of creation. A messenger approached the throne, but this was no mortal herald. The figure that climbed the steps to the citadel was tall and graceful, with features that seemed to shift between elf and man and something altogether other. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond the merely physical. "My lord," it said, and in those words was the music of transformation itself. Word comes from the borders of the world. The barriers grow thin, and beyond them can be seen realms that were never meant to be. The song you sang has reached even to the halls of Eru Iluvatar, and he who created all things stirs in his contemplation. There are some who say that the fourth age draws already toward its close, and that a fifth age beyond all imagining is about to begin. Dunedain nodded slowly, for he had felt the stirring of which the messenger spoke. In the deepest reaches of the night, when the transformed world lay quiet beneath stars that now sometimes sang lullabies, he could sense vast movements in the foundations of reality, changes so profound that they made the transformation of Morgoth's essence seem like a single note in an infinite symphony. "Let it come," he said at last, his voice carrying across the citadel and beyond, to be heard by all who had ears to listen. "We have learned to embrace change rather than fear it, to find wonder in uncertainty rather than seek the false comfort of rigid law. Whatever the fifth age may bring, we shall meet it as we met the transformation of the fourth, with open hearts and voices ready to join whatever new song the music of creation chooses to sing." As if in response to his words, the white tree burst into a chorus of such beauty that all who heard it wept for joy, and across Middle-earth, in every realm touched by the changes they had wrought, voices rose to join the eternal song that played through all things, the song that had no beginning and would have no end, but would continue to transform and be transformed through all the ages of the world and beyond. And in that moment, as the last light of the fourth age faded into the promise of wonders yet to come, all who listened to the song understood that they had been part of something greater than victory over evil. They had participated in the ongoing act of creation itself, adding their own notes to the endless symphony that was existent. The sword had sung in darkness, but the song it began would echo in light forever.